All right, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our 9th week. This week we are very lucky to have Emma to be presenting the case scenario for our theme for adolescent medicine. So what we're going to do now, in addition to that, is Najat going to join actually, Emma?
I don't think so, no. She may. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, I'm afraid.
No problem. So that's absolutely fine. So she's helped you, so she's mentioned here as well, and
Yeah.
you've got me, Susie, and Andrew as well, who will be doing the rest of the appraisal part. So just as a summary for everyone really quickly, the idea of these sessions, what we're going to do is I'll first introduce what we're doing, and then we'll talk a bit about evidence-based medicine. And then I'll let Emma tell us about her clinical scenario, what focus questions she set, and the search and selection of a paper that we're going to appraise. And then what we do is we will separate into small groups today and discuss each giving one side, so validity for one group and results for the other group. And what we'll do is we'll come back together at the end and decide whether or not this is applicable to our population. And as always, we'll add a few things at the end and get your feedback from that. So just as a reminder, with the idea here is not just to use the evidence that we find from the papers that we're going to be appraising today, but also put it into the context of expertise and the environment and the patient themselves. And this requires judgment in addition to the papers that we're appraising, just as a reminder. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take our usual approach where our designated hospital and team, which is represented by Emma today, will be setting our clinical scenario, asking a focus question, and then showing us how they did their search strategy to find the best evidence that we will be appraising. And then in the second section, what we're going to do in separate groups is to look at the validity and the results of the study and decide whether or not this will change our practice and what we will do from there. So the idea is that we learn by example and learn by doing. Now, just very briefly, the way we ask our focus questions will be structured around the well-known PICO format. This is just a useful tool to be able to do it. And that will be the method we will be using in this session as well. So I'll stop at this point and I'll get Emma to introduce the clinical scenario for us.
Thank you. So this is a real life scenario that I was faced with in my role as starting as the clinical fellow for young people's health at St George's Hospital. So I was asked to write the policy, a trust-wide policy for transition. Now, St George's Hospital is a big hospital with lots of different departments covering lots of different specialities, from kind of diabetes through to sort of surgical specialties, ADHD, so lots of different long-term conditions that require transition into adult services. So what I need, sorry. So there are national guidelines for transition, but what I wanted to find out was what are the elements that actually make the biggest difference to young people's to young people's lives and to young people's well-being. So that was my scenario, my question. And for those who aren't so familiar with the concept of transition, what transition means is transition's the process by which you prepare a young person to manage their health more independently and to transfer eventually to adult services. And it is supposed to be a biopsychosocial model, thinking about all aspects of a young person's life, taking into account that a young person with a chronic illness, that this will impact them in many different areas. So next slide, please. So my question was...
Just to check, Emma, do they say write the policy? Do they also say they'll actually implement anything you write?
Well, I mean, that was... Yeah, so we're still in the process of implementation.
And did they give you a pot of money for it?
No, not yet. But what I wanted to do was find some evidence so that actually that I could bring in terms of thinking about the policy and how it's going to work, that I could bring this really diverse group of different teams along with me in terms of thinking about what the ideal would be, what we'd be asking for, and then hopefully that we would be able to persuade people to resource it more effectively. So my question was, in young people with long-term conditions, what elements of care during transition actually improve well-being? And so the PICO was population was young people, long-term conditions, and then that they were transitioning to adult care. Intervention was any transition characteristics, comparison, a lack of transition characteristics, and then outcomes. So I wanted to be quite broad with this, so actually thinking about well-being and participation, as well as health outcomes that are going to vary between different conditions and the different different departments and different diseases that would be kind of encompassed within this policy. Yeah, I think that's the next slide. So this was the search. So this is a search that I used, and actually there's lots of research on transition, but it tends to be really disease specific, and because I needed to think about transition for young people with something like ADHD, as well as for something like diabetes, which are quite sort of different and varied conditions, what I wanted to find was actually some evidence that cut through those differences between individual conditions, and looked at a range of conditions that could potentially be applicable to a range of different specialities. And so yeah, so there wasn't a great deal that looked at transition outside of a single specific disease. So yeah, so there wasn't really any randomized control trials, and so the paper that we've kind of picked out is an observational study. So, but that was the kind of best quality of evidence that was available on this topic.
And just to chip in, I think that also kind of makes sense, because your question, unlike the typical questions we're asking, are really super focused, and you're saying this intervention versus control or versus standard, whereas you're saying you're kind of interested in whatever people might have investigated.
Yeah.
And the nature of a randomized control trial is you're only really going to be able to look at one, maybe two things at once.
Yeah.
So in a sense, to get, even though you may say it's not as high a quality of evidence, to have a piece of research that's looking at a range of factors, it's probably going to have to be an observational study.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you so much, Emma.
No problem.
Now is our time to do the straw poll and see what your views are for this question. So if I can, because there's not that many of us, it would be really nice to hear your voices today.
And unlike a sort of yes or no question, it's going to have to be this time. What we would suggest is, what do you think would be the sort of most effective things you could do to promote good outcomes, health and otherwise, for people with adolescents with chronic health problems who are transitioning? What would you automatically think, before reviewing any evidence, probably matters? And then we can see how your views might be adjusted by the evidence that you see. So type or chat, tell us what you think matters.
Emma, actually, do you want to lead in with this?
Yeah, I can do. So before kind of looking at this paper, I think I'd heard a lot about transition care plans, so having like a sort of a tool that clinicians could use to make a sort of a checklist to make sure that the kind of that the transition to adult services was planned, and that there was sort of a stepwise approach towards helping the young person to develop independence, was one of the things that is in a lot of guidelines. So that was one thing that I thought potentially could be something that helped. Yeah, I think that meeting the adult team and kind of relationship is another thing that sort of, again, I thought about, that I had thought about before as well, because I think that familiarity with a team, and knowing sort of processes and things. It's all made easier if you've got a friendly face there to help.
Like a key worker, you mean?
Yeah.
I think Noella's actually also written in the chat saying that counselling the young person, so kind of on the lines of what you were saying about having someone there to support, to therefore then making transition more informed. And then Ruth said mental well-being, I think, as an outcome is the most important outcome that she wants to look at in terms of ensuring good transition to services.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. So we'll move on to the appraisal part. So Andrew, I think, is going to share the link with the papers in there. And what we'll do is we'll allocate you to either group 1 or group 2, where group 1 looks specifically at the validity and group 2 looks specifically at the results. There's quite a lot of results in here, so we've done some annotations onto the paper just to just focus on particular parts of the results. So if everyone could have a read of the abstract to get an idea about the paper, and then those who are looking at validity specifically focus on methods and the summary of the studies. So the summary of the study will...
Sorry, that's my mistake. I left that from when we did a systematic review.
Yes, we also have characteristics that you can look at as well, which is on a slightly separate additional file. So I think Andrew's posted that as well in the Dropbox.
Yes, there's a few extra images within the Dropbox which come from one of the earlier papers, just gives you a bit more of a description of the cohort and the recruitment.
Thank you. And those in the results group, look at the results group, and we, if you have time, then you can look at either or. Just a quick summary, validity is specifically looking at the design of the study, where we're looking at potential biases, and the results are looking at the what is the effect estimate, how precise they are, and is there a significant relationship. And then together we'll talk about whether or not this is applicable to our population.
Yeah, and specifically for this one, when we come and think about applicability, we'll be encouraging you to think about, on the basis of this evidence, what would you prioritise in your hospital policy for transition? Thinking not only about potential effectiveness, but also about how costly it might be to implement.
So what would you invest your money in? That's the question we'll ask you at the end. Okay, so our 20 minutes starts in right now. So we'll come back, we'll reconvene together at 25 to. And we don't have music this week, so it's going to be a little bit silent, but if you have any questions, please ask us in the chat box, or just directly turn on your microphone and ask us the questions. Okay, we'll see you shortly.
And just to say, if you have any difficulty accessing the files, let us know in the chat. I'll find a way of getting them to you. And if you have any questions because something doesn't make sense, then let me know. The PDF of the paper that's in the Dropbox, I have annotated it a little bit because one of the tables is a bit confusing, it's a bit big. And so to avoid you having to read all the footnotes, I've just written some notes on it. So let the group work commence. I can't find. All right, we are back. So Definite is going to pull up the pro forma, and then we will run through it together and start to think about whether this would influence our decision making or our protocol writing. So question number 1 of section A. So some of you, I hope, were randomised to assess the validity of the study. Although with only 5 of you taking part, there's a chance that none of you were. But assuming some of you have looked at this, did you get the sense that this study addresses a clearly focused issue? You're welcome to speak, you're welcome to type. We're a very small group, so it's very cosy, and we welcome your contributions however you want to make them. I'm hoping there are some keys tapping away at keyboards. I'll give it 10 seconds. Oh, excellent. Noella, yes. Yeah, and we would agree. I mean, it's not as super focused as some, but that's not a bad thing, is it? I mean, you know, some trials are asking a very focused question about a specific intervention. This is asking about quite a number of different outcomes and quite a number of different exposures, but it seems perfectly reasonable to be doing that. And I find that it's quite difficult to formulate this one as a straightforward PICO because there isn't one specific intervention or exposure. They've asked about quite a number of different things together, so it just makes it a little bit difficult to write it out. But yeah, I think it was as focused as it needed to be. So question 2, was the cohort recruited in an acceptable way? They don't give you a lot of description here. There's a lot more description in the protocol, and there's no reason you would have necessarily gone and read the protocol. But what do you think from what you read so far? And you could say, well, yeah, widespread recruitment across several trusts. Yeah, we had England, we had Northern Ireland, we had different trusts. And what do you? And then we also had 3 patients with 3 different sort of categories of disorders, yeah, represented. So that seems good, doesn't it? And Chaitanya, you've pointed that out. So that seems to assist with Emma's aim that she wants something that's fairly generalizable. Great. And what do you think of the exclusions? Did you see who was excluded from the study?
You mean whether it's acceptable or not?
Sorry, say that again.
You mean whether the exclusions are acceptable or not? That's what you're asking.
Yeah. So they did say that they excluded some children. What did you think of that?
Like that will make a total number of patients not representative of the whole population, but it will be difficult to. Yeah.
So Noella's pointed out that they excluded children with significant learning disabilities. Do you think that's reasonable in a study of transition, or do you think that was unreasonable?
I think it's okay-ish because that will be totally different study if we can't assess them in a usual way. I mean.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree as well. Because if you think that transition of children with a significant learning difficulty, that's going to be a very different affair. So yes, and probably much more difficult to complete all of the outcome measures with as well. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and I don't know if anyone would have looked at it, but we did show the flow diagram as a picture, which shows about the recruitment, what proportion of people they approached, they managed to recruit. And there's also a figure that compares those who joined the study with those who didn't join the study. Did anyone get any concerns from those things?
I've just brought it up onto the screen as well. Well, I thought I did. 1 second. It's here.
They approached about 900 people for the study, and they managed to get about 400 of them into the study. And then they compare here those who joined the study with those who didn't join the study. Without labouring the point, the main difference seems to be that those who joined the study had less deprivation than those that didn't join the study. The interquartile ranges still overlap, they're not totally distinct, but there does seem to be a bit of a bias there. And Chaitanya points out people with diabetes are less involved. Was that meaning that the proportion of the diabetics who were approached that was recruited was lower? If we scroll up, Daphne. So diabetes, they approached 232 and they managed to recruit 150. So I think that seems a fairly similar proportion. And Ruth is pointing out that follow-up was reasonable. They managed about 3/4 over the long 2 years. Yeah, and we'll come to that as a question. Okay, so we have, you know, a reasonable cohort. There's always going to be issues. These don't seem to be the worst. So it's, yeah. I looked at the protocol to try and work out if this had been selected by some sort of sampling. You know, did they take lists of thousands of patients and sample a number? It doesn't look like it. It looks like it was very much just approaching all of those that they could identify. Okay, so I think we should say it's worth continuing, which is the next question we're asked. So then, was the exposure accurately measured to minimize bias? Which is to say the exposures here are the factors, the transition factors, the sort of things you could do in the process of transition. So what do you think of the means by which they measured whether children had experienced these transition features? Yeah, PBFs they call them, proposed beneficial features. Okay, I'll chip in. So it looks, oh yeah, okay, many of the okay, yeah, Ruth, that is true. But actually, the good thing is many of these exposures, if everyone was exposed to these beneficial features, the evidence wouldn't help us. We couldn't see a difference. If no one was exposed to them, so actually having around half and half exposed to the features or not is probably really, really helpful. But what we're interested here is how did they measure it? How did they define whether appropriate parental involvement had been encouraged? And if you read the paper, you'll find that this was by a series of yearly interviews. So they had researchers who would conduct interviews with the children, and they would do that having reviewed the children's records as well. So they would have looked at the record to see if it looked like certain things had been done, and then they would talk to the children, find out what they thought had been done, and they might use the medical record to prompt them. So ultimately it was based on the child's own recollection. Did they give you life skills training, yes or no, that sort of thing. So it is based on recollection over the preceding year. So, you know, this is not perfect, but there's no real perfect way to measure these things unless you can somehow video record every interaction they have with their clinic team. Okay, and what about the outcomes? The outcomes here were various tools, all with very confusing names. Mind the Gap, Rotterdam Transition Profile. So then they were all being used to measure different aspects of either the child's satisfaction with the services or with how they felt the transition process has been managed, and also their general transition to independent living. not just in health, but in other domains as well. Now, it's very difficult for us to answer this thoroughly because we haven't seen all of these tools, we've not reviewed all the literature on them. We do know that the Warwick Wellbeing Scale has been validated, so that seems to be based on some robust research. The others, less sure, but you know, so we have to be a little bit cautious. Did anyone have any other thoughts about the outcomes that were measured here? Yeah, Daphne's prompting me here. Noella said earlier, just to say, it's difficult to say if they're exposed to all PBS. Yeah, we're just relying on their recollection. But for this question, was the outcome accurately measured? Blinding, I think, is a potential issue here. The children were recruited into this study. They knew what this study was about. They're interviewed and asked about whether the clinic has done X, has the clinic done Y, has the clinic done Z. And then at some other point, they're being asked to fill in some paperwork, which is saying, how satisfied are you with the way the clinic has done this, that, and the other, you know, as well as other things about their mental well-being. And so it's conceivable to me that the process of being asked about all of these things in interviews could have some influence on the way in which they handle these questionnaires, particularly about maybe their satisfaction with clinics, but difficult to know. But it'd be very difficult to measure any of these things unblinded. Okay, next question. Have the authors identified all important confounding factors? If you didn't get to this and you want to have a glance, this is on stats, where is it? Yes, it is at the top of page 5 in the left-hand column. So they talk about what confounders they considered, what adjustments they made. What do you think of that? Do you think they considered the important confounding factors? Is there anything they missed? Disease severity, absolutely, that wasn't adjusted for. Yeah, so we just have to hope that the disease severity wasn't associated with these other factors that were included. Yeah. See if we can get one more suggestion from anyone. Well, I'll give you our thought when we looked through it. They collected lots of data on socioeconomic scores, but they didn't try to adjust for that. And what if it's the case that actually the children who had poorer socioeconomic scores were less likely to be offered certain things or more likely to be offered certain things? And then actually that could be causing some confounding. So it's a bit disappointing that there was no evidence that that was accounted for. Okay, 5B. Have they taken account of the confounding factors in the design and or analysis? Just for time purposes, we'll just say here that they did, in that they were doing multivariable regression modeling. So they were these confounders, they were putting them in the models and seeing how they influenced things. It's not to say that's the only way they could have done it. It's not to say there couldn't be better ways of doing it, but they have tried. Okay, and Ruth, you already gave us your thoughts. You said that they got 3/4 by 3 years, which you thought was pretty good, and I would agree. I think that's as good as they could manage. And they didn't find major differences between those who completed follow-up and those who didn't, although there were some. So I think we can say yes for 6A. What about the duration of follow-up? They did this over about 3 years. Do you think that was a good period of time to assess their exposure to transition and the outcomes?
Is there any objective way to tell this much duration is enough for a study, or it's
I
just
think it's a judgment. It's so the outcomes they're measuring are their satisfaction with the transition process and how well they have transitioned to managing various aspects of their life and their overall well-being. So do you think, given that they were being recruited between the age of 12 and 12 and what? 14 to 19 years old at recruitment, do you think that that's long enough? Do you think 3 years is long enough to be getting a sense of whether that process went well? Ruth says yes, because they're quite young. Noella says they need some more time, and Chaitanya says yes. And I think for the outcomes that they've measured, absolutely. I think if we're measuring things like the health outcomes, you might actually you might want to see if it's having an impact over a longer term. But then, of course, the effects of these things may get diluted with time. Everyone, even if you have a bad transition, you've got some opportunity to fix things by the time you're 25 or 30 and you'll mature. And, so there's a balance here, actually. In order to see the effect and the critical period, probably this is about the right period of time. Okay, next question. So this is the exciting bit. What did the results show? Now, there's no way that we can aggregate all of the results from this study. There were a lot of results. So what I'm interested in is, what were your key takeaways? What did you see that stuck out to you in the results from this study? So Emma Sunderland says she saw that 3 potentially beneficial factors improved outcomes in a way which was statistically significant. Said that was appropriate parental involvement, promotion of health self-efficacy, and meeting the adult team. Yeah, Ruth says the same. Okay. Okay. Fine. And what did you think of the precision of these results? Now, I think that's a difficult question, because we don't. If we're talking about a weight gain and someone says, oh, a 10-kilogram weight gain plus or minus 1 kilogram, you've got a sense of precision there. I think when you're looking at outcomes which are numbers on a scale and you don't really know what that scale is, it's much harder to interpret precision. But you can still see how precise it is in terms of the difference from 0. A confidence interval that goes from 0.1 to 10 is imprecise, because it's saying anything from not being very far from 0 to being very far from 0. Whereas a confidence interval that goes from 9 to 11, you would say is relatively precise. But I think it's the significance of that precision is harder to interpret. And you'll see that the confidence intervals vary. Some of them seem fairly precise, some of them seem fairly wide, and that's no surprise, because some of these things will have wider distributions in the population, and so you're not going to find precise differences. Okay, right. So what do you think then? Do you believe these results, as you look at the things, the outcomes that they have associated with exposures to things in the clinic? Do you believe them? Do you think that their methods mean that they should be finding true associations? And do you think it's plausible? Or do you think that some of this is implausible? Few seconds, let's see if you've got any thoughts. Yeah, MSS plausible. I agree. I think a lot of the things that come out, particularly those that passed the more stringent threshold, where they had a p-value threshold of 0.01, a lot of them seem to make sense. And some of them look a bit spurious if you look at the weaker relationships. Like, for example, written transition plan having an adverse relationship with romantic relationships. So suggesting that if you had a written transition plan, then when you fill in the survey about your experience of romantic relationships, it's more negative. I don't know. I find it harder to see why that would be connected. So I think, and this is pointing out, as we put on the slides that we're going through while you're doing the appraisal, where you're testing lots of hypotheses, running lots of statistical tests, you've got a much greater chance of finding some spurious things. But yeah, by and large, I think it's plausible stuff. Okay, next question. Will the results help locally? So now we'll just merge this into one question. So based on what you've seen now, speak or type, and thinking not just about the evidence, but about the practicality. So thinking about how easy it is to do these things as well. Which three of the things would you prioritize for implementation in your protocol for transition or your guideline for transition? Give us your thoughts.
Actually, given that Emma might be taking this forward, which one would you think, Emma, you would choose in your guideline?
Just going. Yeah, so I think there's the three that had the sort of the most significant impact were all relevant, but particularly appropriate parental involvement, because that seemed to have an impact across all of the domains. Now it's not necessarily the easiest thing to achieve, but I feel like that's the thing that we should center everything else around, really.
But do you think it's expensive?
Not necessarily. I think it's more about the clinicians and their kind of attitude, potentially training implications. But I think it's more an approach rather than anything that's going to cost additional money.
Yeah. So yeah, that struck me. You know, the parental involvement seems like an easy win if you believe that involving parents appropriately is easy.
Yeah, yeah. That's the tricky bit.
What else? What else gets into your list?
I mean, the promotion of health self-efficacy, improving satisfaction with services, and I think that just tells us something that, you know, that hopefully we already know that people want to be involved, that young people want to be involved in their care, and to be supported to gain that confidence and that independence.
Okay.
And again, that's something that's sort of cheap, but not necessarily the easiest thing to do.
Yeah. And I think you were hinting at something that I picked up on when I was looking through the results, that in a sense the mind the gap, which is their satisfaction with the transition process and with what's offered in the clinic, that seems to me the less important. Of course I want people to be satisfied, but actually what you want are the harder outcomes. They're transitioning, they're independent, they've got good mental health. So yes, I agree, it wasn't top of my priority list. Yeah, and a third one?
I mean, meeting the adult team, that seems to have a big impact in terms of mainly focused on the Rotterdam profile, which looked more at participation. That's important for young people's lives.
Yeah. So that,
but logistically more difficult.
They start to take more responsibility for managing their own healthcare, contacting the services. They become more autonomous in the appointments by virtue of meeting the adult teams.
Yeah.
Is that an incrimination of paediatricians?
I think it just tells us that, well, but having that relationship and like feeling comfortable in that relationship, I think is the important the important step. But yeah, I think we do that.
I thought it was interesting that some of the more expensive ones, or at least more painful ones, don't come out. Like key worker, doesn't really seem to come out with much. And it's not that the confidence intervals are super wide. I mean, key worker basically, they're a bit more satisfied with some things, but actually nothing else came out. Holistic life skills training, you got some positivities there, particularly domestic independence, which makes sense. Written transition plan just means that the young person tells you they're more satisfied with the process, which is nice, but it's quite a lot of work probably.
Yeah. I think with the written transition plan, what I've kind of taken away from that is that, like, I feel like the transition plan might help services potentially more than it helps the young person. It helps you to kind of prove what you're doing, but it's not like a new pro forma never solves anything. It's much more about attitudes and relationships and that kind of thing.
And it's interesting that in terms of gaining autonomy in appointments, if you look at the estimates, meeting the adult team before transfer has this great effect in year 3, 1.46, compared to age-banded clinic has a significant effect in the first year. So that sort of makes sense to me, because the age-banded clinic is going to hopefully encourage more autonomy and better sort of consistent behaviour of the clinicians at the early stage of the transition. And the meeting the adult team is going to help you in the later stage of the transition. Okay, fine. So overall, we've got some thoughts, and it seems I haven't had any sort of contradicting views. So if we can go back to the slides, Defna, I'll wrap up. We're just about on time.
It's just taking a bit of time to understand.
All right, we get on the, okay, great. So we've talked through some feedback and thoughts. We talked through your views as best as we can. So this, I won't dwell on this, but this was just thinking about the complexity of association and causation. It's a complex area. You know, as we always talk about, association doesn't imply causation. When you read into this in depth, you end up in philosophy as well as science. You end up in statistics and theology. But just remember that when we're looking for effective interventions, by definition, we're looking for causal association. We're looking to say that treatment A or thing that we can do is associated with better outcomes because it causes them. And for that reason, we prefer randomized trials. And if we're using observational data, we want to try and adjust for things which might confound that association. When we're looking to understand etiology, we want to know what causes something. Again, we're looking for causal associations. So in this case, we may be saying factor A is associated with a disease because it's somewhere on a causal pathway. And so again, we need to try and adjust for things that stand in the way of that, stand aside of that and can confound it. However, sometimes when people do studies, what they want to do is make predictions. They want to give prognoses. Will you survive or not? How long will you survive? Do you have a DVT or not? I'm thinking Wells score. In those sort of circumstances, you don't care about causality or confounding. Even if you've got a non-causal factor that's acting as a predictor, that's great, use it. Because if it helps you predict, that's fine. So this, in our case here, different ways of asking the questions about transition factors would demand slightly different analyses. And often when we read articles or when people write articles, they're not very explicit about it. So if we simply wanted to say, well, which transition factors are associated with better well-being, where we don't care about causality, then you would just do a simple analysis for pairwise association. Factor A versus well-being, factor B versus well-being, factor C versus well-being, and those would be called univariable analyses. If you then want to say, okay, but are they independently associated with better well-being, which is to say, if factor A and factor B tend to be done together, then can we do an analysis where we only take the factor that's got the stronger association, and that would be called a multivariable analysis, where you put all the factors together in a model, and that's what they did here. If you then want to actually be looking for causal associations, then you're going to have a careful think about what the causal pathways might be. and about how confounders may impact that, and then take account of them. And most frequently, that means that people add the potential confounding factors to the model. So you end up with something like factor A plus factor B plus factor C plus your confounders. How are they all together associated with well-being? And that would be, again, a multivariable analysis like regression. But in this paper, what was disappointing was the confounding just didn't seem to have been thought about very much. They just sort of threw in some things, and I would have liked to have seen more consideration of that. And then if we wanted to say, how can we best use transition factors to predict well-being, we'd probably take a similar approach to number 2, but instead of keeping predicted in our model on the basis of whether they were significantly associated, whether we can be really confident there's a true association, you'd keep things in the model based on how much they improve the accuracy of the predictions. So you'd do a similar process, but your goal would be different. I'm going to paste in a little link if you're really interested in causal inference and the sort of stats behind it, etc. There's an amazing presentation which is a bit mind-bending. About causal inference. I'm just pasting the link there. Someone who's done, oh, I've sent it just to one person. Yeah, it's about an hour and a half presentation, probably not for the faint-hearted, but it's kind of fun. And about someone who spent a lot of time working at how we can use observational data to try and make inferences about what works and what doesn't work. Sorry, back to the slides. Next slide. Great, so that means we're basically done. If you're willing, we're always happy with seeing your feedback, and it does influence how we run the sessions. We've got a bit better at getting the papers out in advance, I hope. We would love volunteers to get involved in future sessions. I'm going to paste some other resources for you into the chat. They're there. We can go to the next slide. So thank you very much for your time. There's 2 e-learning courses that are online, that are free, that give you an introduction to some of the principles that we often don't have the time to go over in these sessions. And there are some links there as well to other resources. Archimedes section in Archives of Disease of Childhood is wonderful. You get these really short articles, often asking questions, a bit like we ask, and reviewing maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 papers and giving you a considered opinion. And don't forget, the Bubbles has some great evidence-based medicine reviews as well. Thank you so much for your participation. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and we will hope to see you all again next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.